Emily loved photography. She thrived on capturing fleeting moments, the kind people didn't notice until it was frozen in a photograph. At the fair that evening, she wandered through stalls, her camera hanging from her neck, ready for a candid shot. That's when she saw him. A man standing among the crowd, staring at nothing in particular, yet smiling as though he knew a secret no one else did. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down her spine. But it was also the kind of moment Emily craved to capture. She lifted the camera, adjusted the focus, and snapped the shot. The click of the shutter felt louder than it should have, like an unsettling punctuation to a sentence left unfinished. The man didn't react. He didn't flinch, blink, or even acknowledge her. He just stood there, grinning as though he had been waiting for her to take the picture. Feeling uncomfortable, Emily turned away quickly and disappeared into the crowd, but a lingering unease followed her home. Later that night, in the dim light of her apartment, Emily transferred the photos from her camera to her laptop. One by one, she scrolled through them until she reached his photo. She leaned closer, squinting. That's odd. The grin in the picture looked wider than it had in real life. Unnaturally so. The corners of his mouth seemed stretched, almost as if they were pulled too tightly. And his eyes, they looked off, empty, like the smile was just a mask. She tried to shake the uneasy feeling, brushing it off as an overactive imagination. The fair had been crowded, noisy, overwhelming. Maybe that's why the photo seemed strange, she thought. Emily hit print. Moments later, the photograph slid out of the printer. She held it in her hands, her thumb tracing over the image. There it was again, that grin. Wide-stretched, wrong. And yet, there was something magnetic about it, like the smile was challenging her to keep looking, daring her to try and make sense of it. Emily placed the photo on her desk and decided to call it a night. But sleep didn't come easily. The sound of the camera's shutter clicking echoed in her mind as she tossed and turned. Finally, she drifted off, but not before a vague sense of unease took root. She woke abruptly sometime around 3 a.m. A notification lit up her phone screen, a text message from an unknown number. "Keep smiling, Emily." Her heart froze. She sat up in bed, staring at the message, trying to comprehend what she was seeing. She hadn't told anyone her name at the fair, certainly not the man she photographed. So, who sent this? Fingers trembling, she deleted the message, convincing herself it was just a weird prank. But as she lay back down, the silence in her apartment felt heavier, more oppressive. The next morning, Emily shuffled into the kitchen, still groggy. As she sat at her desk with a cup of coffee, she noticed the photograph had fallen to the floor. Strange. She was sure she'd placed it securely on the desk the night before. She picked it up and froze. The grin was wider than before. The smile now stretched almost ear to ear, and the man's teeth looked sharper, like a predator's. Emily's stomach twisted. She placed the photo back on her desk and took a few steps back, her heart pounding in her chest. Just then, the camera on her desk clicked, on its own. Emily stared at the camera, paralyzed with fear. The lens turned slowly, as if it were looking for something. Then it stopped, pointing directly at her. Another click, another photo taken. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up with shaky hands, dreading what she would see. Another text from the unknown number. "Keep smiling." Emily spent the next few days in a state of unease. Every time she looked at the photograph, the smile seemed slightly different. Wider, sharper, more sinister. But what unnerved her the most were the people around her. It started with her neighbor. Mrs. Cartwright, usually grumpy and silent, greeted Emily with a smile, wide and empty. The same unsettling grin from the photograph. Her lips stretched too far, exposing all her teeth, and her eyes stayed cold. "Such a lovely day, isn't it?" she whispered, holding the smile. At work, her coworkers smiled in the same eerie way too. Even strangers on the subway seemed to grin as they glanced in her direction. This can't be real, she thought. It's in my head. It has to be. But deep down, she knew something was very wrong. That night, as Emily brushed her teeth, she noticed her reflection lingered in the mirror for a second longer than it should have. The reflection smiled, her lips curling upward into that familiar, twisted grin, while Emily's own face remained neutral. Her breath hitched. She stepped closer to the mirror, her heart racing. Her reflection smiled wider, almost tauntingly. Emily backed away, but the reflection stayed, grinning in the same unnatural way. Then it whispered, "Keep smiling." The lights flickered. When they came back on, the reflection had returned to normal, neutral, lifeless. But Emily's skin prickled with a cold dread she couldn't shake. Terrified, Emily decided to get rid of the photo once and for all. She tore it to shreds and flushed it down the toilet. Feeling a small sense of relief, she collapsed onto her couch, trying to calm her pounding heart. But when she checked her phone a few minutes later, the photograph was there, reappeared in her photo gallery perfectly intact. Worse, the smile on the man's face had grown even more monstrous. It was no longer just a grin, it was a snarl, jagged teeth exposed, like a predator closing in on its prey. Another text appeared. "Smile, Emily." Emily reached out to the only person she trusted, her best friend Sarah. She called her, her voice trembling as she tried to explain what was happening. "You have to see it to believe it," Emily whispered, sending the photo to Sarah's phone. Minutes later, Sarah arrived at her apartment. But the moment Emily opened the door, she froze in horror. Sarah was already smiling, that same awful, stretched grin. "Emily?" Sarah whispered, her voice soft but unnatural. "I just wanted to see you, and tell you to smile too." Sarah's eyes were glassy and empty, her grin unrelenting. Emily stumbled backward, her breath caught in her throat, and Sarah stepped inside, her movements slow and deliberate, as if under someone else's control. Emily watched, paralyzed with fear, as Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out the photograph, perfectly whole. "He gave it to you," Sarah whispered with that horrific grin. "And now you have to give it to someone else." Emily's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen through blurry eyes, her heart pounding in her ears. Another message. "Keep smiling." Her vision swam as she stared at Sarah's grin, realizing with cold certainty that there was no escape. Emily sat in her apartment, gripping her phone tightly. Sarah's wide grin haunted her every thought, the same twisted smile she'd seen on the man in the photo. The curse was spreading like a sickness, and now it had reached her best friend. The thought gnawed at her. There's only one way out. Sarah's final words echoed in her mind. "You have to give it to someone else." Emily couldn't breathe. Every time she tried to force her lips into a neutral expression, they curled back up on their own, like invisible strings were pulling them. She looked into the mirror. Her reflection was already grinning, with a smile not her own. With trembling hands, Emily scrolled through her phone, looking for a stranger. Someone, anyone, to pass the curse to. Her eyes landed on a contact, a delivery driver she'd met briefly the week before. Her heartbeat raced as she crafted a text message. "Can you stop by? I want to take your picture for a project." She hit send before her guilt could stop her. Minutes later, the delivery driver responded with a polite, "Sure, I'll be there soon." Emily stood in front of the mirror, practicing her smile. It hurt to force it, every muscle in her face ached as though the grin was growing heavier. When the delivery driver arrived, Emily invited him inside, pretending everything was fine. The man gave her a curious look, but she waved it off with a forced laugh. "It's just for a small photography project," she said, lifting her camera. "Stand right there." The man smiled, an ordinary, polite smile. It was so human, so normal, it almost made her back out of her plan. But she knew she couldn't. "This is the only way to stop it," she thought. She lifted the camera. "Say cheese," she whispered, her voice trembling. The shutter clicked. In that split second, the man's face shifted. His grin stretched wider, his eyes darkened, and his polite smile twisted into something sinister. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She pressed the shutter again and again as if the camera could protect her from what she had done. The man lowered his head slowly, then looked back at her. His grin now the same grotesque smile from the photograph. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. "Thank you," he whispered, lips curling back even further. Relief washed over Emily. It's over, she thought. I'm free. She collapsed onto her couch, the weight of the curse finally lifting off her shoulders. But just as she was about to relax, her phone buzzed. Another text message appeared on the screen. "Keep smiling, Emily." Her reflection in the darkened window grinned back at her, impossibly wide. Tears welled in her eyes as the corners of her mouth curled upward, far beyond what was natural. The curse wasn't gone, it wasn't even transferred. It was shared, multiplying, spreading further with every forced grin. Emily tried to scream, but her lips wouldn't move. Her mouth was locked in the cursed smile. Her phone buzzed again and another text came through. "Smile forever." The camera on her desk clicked by itself. Emily's reflection in the window giggled, silent and gleeful, and the screen faded to black.